Yep, you
Is
are.
someone? Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I guess all of these things are true. The most important part is that if this workshops was on winning finals, I would do very bad because I never win them. But most of the advice that I'll give you is probably useful to getting to the finals in the first place. So let's start there, I guess. Also, please, a few of you are not muted and I can hear myself. So if you could just make sure that you're muted. Great. Okay, amazing. Okay, cool. So I wanted to just get a rough sense of what is the level of the group. So I'm gonna ask like just a few questions, and if you could just use the reaction button and like just use any reaction you want to the question. How many of you are in debating for more than a year? Okay. Very few of you, or most of you are not even listening. I'll see. And how many of you have broken out an international tournament?
Wait, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, how many of you have broken out an international tournament in BP? Or other formats, I guess. It's not civic. Yeah, you can record, guys. No worries. Okay, cool. I just wanted to get a sense of what we're working with in case some of the things I might let out. Okay, so the section, the lecture is not gonna be super structured, but I think that I have some structure put down. And I think the first part is basically understanding that there is no magic solution to this problem. At the end of the day, in order to win many of these motions and win in debating, you need to read and learn a lot of facts. And spec knowledge can be very, very useful in particular situations. So the first questions that I wanted to answer in this workshop is more on how can we actually prepare ourselves for these types of motions, and how can we actually accumulate the so-called spec knowledge in order to do good at these debates. So kind of like how to avoid getting into a situation where you don't know anything in the first place, because I feel like this is going to be also useful. I think there are a couple of things here that I want to mention. So firstly, starting with understanding the basic principles. I think this is just like comes out, the younger you are, the harder these things will be. With time, it will get much easier because life is gonna teach you a few things. But you need to start learning more about things that you are not so well versed in. So for example, macroeconomics, psychology, history of social movements, history of geopolitics. There are like, I think familiarizing yourself with the world map is extremely important, because you will be surprised how much and how often it comes up argument that is connected to a trade route or a border, or whether, for example, a certain country is landlocked or is able to have particular ports. But also a lot of the facts are connected to these geographical realities. I would also recommend Prisoners of Geography as a good start, although obviously some things in that book are oversimplified, in my opinion, but they do provide a good ground for understanding why just the actual space that you are in can heavily impact your politics and everything else, which I think that if you think about it with any example in the world is most likely to be true, be it an island nation that is more disconnected or something like that. So yeah, understand these things, and with time you'll learn more about the world and kind of make it a habit of learning these things. The second thing that I have as advice is especially if you are in the situation of, okay, I'm now going to be preparing myself for this big tournament that I want to win, or this big international one, or a major international one, etc., etc. What I have done many years ago, and I actually kept up with it because I think it's a general better way, is you actually have a lot of ability to fill your social media feed with news sources and train the algorithm to bring out a lot of these news sources. How would you go about that? It's pretty easy. You unfollow a lot of shit that are not crucial to your life, including people, and you follow a lot of news sources, all of the news sources, the American ones, the Russian ones, the ones that you don't like, the ones that you like, all of them, regardless of like what social media. Or you can even like literally make an account in a specific social media that you don't generally use so much and just fill it with news. For example, back in the day, Instagram was not so big in Bulgaria. So when I created my Instagram, there wasn't many people there involved. So the first thing that I did is I filled my news feed with just all of the big Instagram accounts of big news sources. And what happened is that every time that I would go on Instagram, is
Oh, sorry, Nikki, you're muted. I accidentally muted you. I'm so sorry. I was trying to mute someone else.
no worries, no worries. I just said please mute yourself. So, so yeah, when I went, every time I went to my Instagram account and I would scroll, the thing that you are now probably all addicted to, you would be bombarded with what the fuck is going on in the world, and that's pretty useful because it's like you're creating a pattern of learning more and more and more, and like even being aware, this is I think crucial, even being aware of just the headlines of what's going on in the world this week can sometimes be the difference between you understanding that something has happened. So maybe you don't know what exactly has happened, but oh, I saw this headline that Russia did this thing last week. which was obviously a provocation. So there's something going on over there. And you start building on top of that fact, and that can work a long way from like even creating a debate argument or like giving an example in a sense. So that's another way that you can do this. I think the last advice that I would give to you on accumulating spec knowledge, or specifically for debating, is there are many motion type workshops out there that are specifically made by debaters to cover wide range of topics in the context of debate motions. What does this mean? It's basically like debating economics, debating psychology motions, debating social movements, all of these particular things. And they will give you in these workshops a great combination between basic facts and examples that you can actually use or even learn more about on your own time, but also some general principles on how to approach these types of motions. So the next time, even if you don't know the most recent information, you're most likely to know some examples that you can draw your arguments upon or draw some analogies on. So these are the main things that I recommend. Just learn in general, understand the world map and geopolitics, follow news sources, so read the fucking news, and take advantage of these motion specific workshops that are out there. And over time you accumulate a lot of information, and this is the beauty of it all. It gets better with time. So even though knowledge heavy motions require more groundwork, in essence they're like any other motion. So once you do enough debate motions in general, you will start noticing many patterns, and you will start look for the same argument each time. So for example, if you've done 10 motions on social movements, or like what should the feminist movement do in this type of sense, you're most likely at the end of the day going to notice a pattern of usually there are a couple of topics or trade-offs that exist within these debates. So with social movements, what is one of the first things that you notice about the pattern? Most of the time, there is a huge trade-off between the most devoted members of the social movement versus the average person who might be engaged. So there is sometimes, most of the time, inherent clash between critical mass of the social movement and the most devoted members who require stronger stances, more specific positions. And these things trade off with each other in different ways. So regardless of the context, the arguments will follow the same. It is the same with knowledge-specific motions, with states, with international relations a lot of the time. So these patterns you will start to notice anyway, regardless of whether you know more. And when you accumulate the basic information of like, I know Russia is not actually a democracy in this type of sense. If you know these particular things, it will get much easier. Somebody was raising their hand. I'm not sure if this was on purpose or not, but if you want to ask me a question, just go ahead in the chat and I will give you the word. Just type question or just type the question itself. It doesn't really matter. Just so I know that you actually want to ask a question and you're not just misclicking a button. Cool. So Yeah, that's one caveat. So when are we including examples in our debate? How much depth should we include? I'll get to that a little bit later, to the examples. The easy answer here is if you have examples and you think they're useful, use them. But if you're not sure about them, then keep it as basic as possible. You don't want to get lost in your own example. So make sure that you understand the example and why you're using this example. Don't just give an example on its own, and vice versa. Don't, and this is really important, connected to something that I wanted to say next. Don't just say the example and expect that people will understand now what you mean. I have seen many times people fail on motions that they know a lot about, myself included, exactly because they are not able to utilize their knowledge and break the knowledge down to the main principles of the debate and focus on the clash at hand. So for example, I work in renewable energy. I know a shit ton a lot about how this industry works. In bigger debates about like generally renewable energy, or like when I'm making arguments, I have had situations where I go too much into detail, completely outside of the knowledge of the average informed voter. And I confuse myself and the judge by trying to explain all of these building blocks that you need to understand in order to figure out this particular argument. So it's always good to sense check these things with your debate partner. And in that sense, it's very useful to like work with a debate partner that have different interests than you. And this is probably the last advice on how to generally deal with these things is you most likely never be great at all of the motions, but if you're prepping for a big tournament with a partner, you can divide the topics together and have different strong parts and know different things. For example, you can literally divide the world in two, like or like in regions, and say, okay, you get to follow for the next 2 months more about European politics. I'll take Latin America or something like this, because it will be impossible to understand, like for one person to do all these things. And if let's say a European motion comes up, then one of you have a little bit more knowledge on it, which a lot of the time is more than enough. So this is another way that you can actually get better at this. And in terms of depth, I don't think that many of the times depth is that needed. It's more about like depth as a word. I think it's weird to me, but it's more about like literally breaking down what does this mean. What are the people involved? What are the incentive mechanisms? I'll get to that a little bit later, into how to actually do these arguments and what question you should ask yourself when you're constructing the case, even if you don't know a lot about the topics. So this is the first part of the workshop. I guess the conclusion here is just, it's one round at the end of the day. So don't overthink these parts and realize that this is a gradual process. Improving in debating in general, and with improving in debating, we learn a lot about new stuff. And this is partly the reason why we do this, is you get into rooms on specific motions, and maybe you fuck up and maybe you lose, but you actually get up to understand a lot of things. Or maybe this will give you the ability to then, after the motion, go read a little bit more on the topic so that you don't feel so out of hand the next time you debate these types of motions. And this is the part of like the learning process of why we do debating in the first place. So be curious, ask people. You see somebody, like you have in international tournaments sometimes people who have had PhDs on some of these topics. So it is useful to just talk with them and ask them questions and make them spread the knowledge around. And I think finally, like when you're reading information, actually try to understand it. Don't just like facts. Actually try to visualize what is going on in the situation and break it down for yourself. I'll give you an interesting example of like artificial islands in the South China Sea, right? There are many intricate details about how those are being done and how they're being used and their political impact, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, there are like hardline facts of like, if you have good positioning in these particular areas, these are literal islands that you control, that you create. This is a huge impact into your ability to like wage war or like protect yourself, etc., etc. And you don't have to understand all of it to understand some of it, right? So like the example is, I was in the debate about the South China Sea, and I literally spent a minute and a half of my speech because everybody in the debate was super confused. I was like, hey, they literally take the sand, put it in the middle of the sea, they create the islands and they put the guns there. That's pretty bad. Depending on who you ask, of course. But this super basic information dump cleared up a lot of weird clashes that were happening so far in the debate, because everybody was trying to like think super big ideas and try to use their spec knowledge on South China Sea. But at the end of the day, it was super simple, real life problem of these things are there, you can now not move them, and it will get much worse and much worse. So that's one example of how like it's kind of spec knowledge, but it's not like I read 50,000 papers on it or like spent 10 hours researching it. No, I just read an article and I was like, damn, how does an artificial island look like? So I just Googled it and I saw a picture. I was like, okay, this is literally sand. How do they make them? Okay, I see a big ship with a lot of sand on it, etc., etc. It's obviously a bit more complicated, but at the end of the day, this is part of the process. And when you understand these things and you try to understand them and you ask yourselves the right questions, it will inevitably be very useful in debates. So the more you know about some parts of the world, so if you start with just learning about the things that are interesting to you or like are interesting to you in your own region, the more you will see the patterns with different countries. So for example, maybe you don't know much about country X, but you know country X is an authoritarian regime, and you know about other authoritarian regimes. So you can safely assume that some of the patterns are fairly similar. There is an authoritarian leader there. This leader probably controls the army. But the army in itself is another actor that needs to be taken care of. So if you stop their money or something like this authoritarian leader might have a problem with the army. It might destabilize the government, etc., etc. Or authoritarian leaders can make shitty decisions for their people, and just because they want to, etc., etc. So you now take this into account when you are trying to make arguments about whether they will do something or how they will react to economic pressure, etc., etc. Obviously, this is super basic. It doesn't require any information apart from understanding that if I apply economic sanctions to authoritarian state that doesn't care about its citizens, because the leader of that state is not going to be democratically kicked out of the government or something like this, it means that maybe economic sanctions are not necessarily super useful. In other cases, obviously, it might be a little bit different, but it's safe to assume that this is to a level true, just because you know the fact that this is an authoritarian state or fairly authoritarian state in these particular cases. So this is one example of like just using the knowledge that you already have to essentially make an argument and like set up an analysis without really knowing what you're talking about. I think what are some other things that you should do once you receive the motion? Definitely use the info slide. A lot of CA teams have essentially an invested interest into actually making sure that they give you at least some knowledge on the topic, because the truly like knowledge heavy motions that are required are usually not about the big players that you all heard of. All of you know some things about the USA, some things about China, some things about Russia. So especially over time, the more that you are debating or just learning about the world, you have some idea of how do these countries operate and maybe what are their interests. So these motions are not going to be like super hard for you, or you'll have some idea of what to do in them. The more harder, the more spec knowledge motions that you struggle with are with regions or countries that you don't know much about at all. And CA teams know that and understand that. There are two levels to this. Firstly, it means that they will try to set up the clash in the debate very clear so that you know what exactly is going on. Secondly, they will give you some information in the info slides. Thirdly, they will most likely provide useful answers in clarifications if you ask them. So there are ways in which you can extract a little bit more information without directly asking these particular things. Or if you just look at clarifications, if they're, for example, being done in the chat, if it's an online tournament. So this can also be useful in some scenarios. Knowing all of this, there is another level to this, which is CA teams understand that if you are less likely to know about this motion, you know who else is less likely to know much about this motion? The judges. And this is the meta game part of all of this. It means that they are less likely to give like super case specific examples in the motions if it's going to confuse the judges. So in that sense, you'll likely get most of the time motions that are somewhat accessible. And when that doesn't happen, you also have to understand that if somebody out in the debate is stating 5 facts they read on The Economist about these things, but is not really explaining them, the judge is most likely also not picking up on these examples. So you need to, again, use this to your advantage and break down the examples into the actual argument and the logical conclusions that are being drawn from them. So what is the actual explanation of why this is likely to be done? What is the logical reasoning behind this example that you're giving? Or is your whole argument just, well, they did it in Libya, so they do it in Afghanistan or whatever? This is not an argument, right? Or at least it's not a very persuasive one in the context of international debating. So most likely you can just call out people of like, you're not giving me an actual analysis. There is nothing that I can rebuttal. Maybe it is true for this example. I'm not exactly true why, and I'm not exactly sure why this is likely to be true in my example, or like in this particular debate. So there are two options here. Either they didn't give you the analysis, so you can just call them out and move on with the debate, or there is an underlining analysis to the example being given, and then you just need to logically engage with the argument. So they gave this example and then they explained they have the incentive to do this because of this and this reason. And then you have to see, do they have these incentives? And many of these incentives will be connected to not just basic facts that they know about the country, but basic facts on how governments operate. For example, in a lot of these IR motions. So they might say they have an incentive to do this because there is a lot of political instability currently in that region. And then you can attack that directly and say, well, actually, this political instability means that they are less likely to make such big moves because they are afraid that they're not going to be able to implement them correctly because maybe they might not be in power in the next few months, or they're not going to be able to negotiate strongly with them and they'll make worse deals, etc., etc. And all of these are things that you can say without actually knowing whether this is the specific information in these particular cases. So that's another way how you can engage into these situations. So yeah, understand the context of the round, the CAs, the judges, and use that to your advantage. And most of the time you'll be fine. The next thing that I want to give as an advice is draw analogies from your own experience. I think this is like super important. This is like we are getting to the nitty-gritty of my whole debate philosophy. You definitely, as a person, you're somebody who is engaged in debating, you're a smart individual who knows some stuff. You at least know a lot of stuff about your own country, your own reality, because most of the time you're an active citizen that cares about your history, your important topics of the day. Use that to your advantage, and it will open up new worlds for you. Can we mute the person who is unmuted? Thank you. It will open up new arguments for you. It will open up new worlds of debating for you. It is super, super important. What do I mean by all of this? If you look at a particular motion in general, this is not only about spec knowledge motions, but in general, try to draw analogies from your own experience. You will think of of different patterns that you can apply that maybe other people in the context of international tournament will not be able to pick up on, because everybody has different situations. But more specifically for spec knowledge, it will serve as a very good way for you yourself to explain to yourself what is the logical reasoning behind what I'm trying to do here. And the way to do it is, again, try to use analogies from your own experience. So let's make an interesting comparison, all right? Let's say I'm from Pakistan and I'm debating a motion for about Bulgaria. I don't know shit about Bulgaria. What the fuck is Bulgaria? I only know, maybe I've heard of this Nikki guy, but that's most of it. And let's also think about the vice versa. I'm from Bulgaria, I'm from the Balkans, and I get a motion about Pakistan. I don't know much about Pakistan either. So in this weird situation, how can I draw particular conclusions from small things that I know about these countries? So if I know just a little bit, I'll probably know that, for example, similar to how Pakistan was under British colonial rule, Bulgaria was under Ottoman rule for large periods of time. Now, there's a lot of specifics into this context, obviously, but the similarities are there in certain ways for sure. For example, I, as somebody who is coming from a country that went through this experience of being colonized, not having an independent state that is connected to your national identity, for example, know how somebody feels about this, how it might affect your political discourse in the next 200 years, how it might, for example, affect your political landscape in terms of how stable it is. For example, I can draw the conclusion that at certain point there was a struggle for independence, and a lot of the people who are talking now, like the political discourse or like the national identity, the history is connected to the people who were fighting for that independence, because it's an important historical moment of building the identity of a nation. We probably both have some territorial disputes in this particular sense, both Pakistan and Bulgaria, because when you're struggling for independence, most of the time, it's hard to get your original territories back. So this means that maybe there are a lot of people in these territories that I care about, or maybe it means that these territorial disputes are super, super important to the national population and how people feel about them. So if I'm, for example, making an argument on like somebody in this weird Bulgarian motion is talking about like, oh, it's fine, the Bulgarians right now don't care so much about this. They'll take this deal because it will give them a lot of money and that's more important to them. And then I can stand up and say, no, you don't understand what it is to be connected to a particular territory. It's not just a piece of land. It is part of your national identity in this particular sense. And you can say these things and make this analysis, even if you don't know the full extent of what is this territorial dispute in Bulgaria, or where is this territory, and things like that. So these analogies and the human experience and humanizing the motion and humanizing your arguments can go a long, long way. Because the analogies of how humans feel in certain situations can be easily drawn, even if the context is a little bit different, the facts are a little bit different, because usually it's about very core ideas such as identity, such as anger, such as struggle, etc., that are very, very intertwined and connected. So this is how you can draw analogies from your own experience and make interesting arguments, and also think about how all of these things make people feel. And the way that people feel is important, firstly on a principle level, but secondly on a practical level, in how they will react to certain things, and whether somebody will do it because of that reaction, for example, their leader. So you see how all of these things, like once you think about them, you can go a very, very long way into analyzing a debate motion without actually knowing so much information about the context. And you can make safe conclusions. And most of the time, these conclusions are going to be, if you explain them correct, are going to be logically sound. And this is more than enough when you need to convince the average involved voter. Because debating is not about like the single truth. There is no single truth. Most of these debate motions include different trade-offs. And the truth not always prevails in debate rounds. This is very, very important. So when you're making these arguments, you have to fake it till you make it in a large sense. I'm not telling you to outright lie, but might as well give it your all. And then the good thing is, even if you lie or if you're not sure if you're telling the truth, then after the debate, sit down and learn a little bit more. So next time you actually have even more of the context that you're talking about. So that's an important way to look at this debate. I would say, apart from that, there are a couple of like obvious sentences that I can say on this topic, like asking yourself the questions, why would they give this motion? Motions have inherent trade-offs always. This is like the crucial part of a debate motions. So think about what would they be. I will later discuss a couple of examples, but this is generally important. Listen to the other teams, sense check their facts, try not to push the debate in another direction, accept some of the burdens that they're trying to push you if they're not such a big burdens, accept that maybe they're correct in this particular example, but don't get focused on the example at all. All of these things are important. And you always know some things, right? I don't know the particular reason, but why would they do this? Why would this country care? What are the main actors in this country? What would they care about? How would they react if something happens? A lot of the groundwork is done in characterization of the debate. Even if this characterization is not entirely true, if it's logically consistent, it will get you a long way, a lot of the time. And sometimes, even if a team stands up and call you out with just fact, but does not attack the logic, it will be enough. It will not be enough for you to lose the debate, because sometimes people who have spec knowledge, I already mentioned this, overestimate how much of that is shared with the judges or everybody else in the room. So you always try to logically do this. You always try to say, even if you don't know about this fact, it is why generally this is not going to happen. Because we know this other information, because actually these people care about these other things. All of these are true. So by the end, I'll just give you a couple of examples with debate motions. So I'll also type them in the chat. Here is a debate motion with the info slide. It's from 2023 Worlds. So this house believes that the Pacific Alliance should introduce a common currency. And the info slide is, what is the Pacific Alliance? It's a Latin American trade bloc formed by Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. So I'll just give you a brief example of what we did with this motion at Worlds. To this day, I have to be honest, I don't know super much about any of these countries. I know a lot of specific facts about some of them, but not necessarily connected to their currency or like what parts of their economies work with what. But I know some facts, right? I know that some parts of the Mexican economy are connected to exporting to the US. So this might be affected by the currency exchange. This is one part. I know that some of these countries are struggling with like political instability, or they're struggling with like problematic administration, etc., etc. What else do I know in these things? Well, in my case, I actually know because my own country is currently trying to adopt the euro currency, that I know that this is a super dragged out process that needs a lot of things to be done in order to implement it correctly. And there is another caveat. In order for it to be done, I also know that if you don't do it properly, it's going to increase hugely inflation, and it's going to hurt a lot of people, especially in the short term. So is it reasonable to say that all of these countries might fuck up the way that they introduce the common currency? I think yes, because they don't have reasonable experience with it. They have old administrations in these particular cases. They're huge pieces of land that it's hard to control prices and actually do all of these things. So it might actually, even if it's good in the long term, be very, very problematic and chaotic in the short term. And this is it. This is the argument that we run in the end of the day. That it has nothing connected to any particular specific knowledge that I know about any of these countries, apart from saying, in any case, adopting a new currency, especially a common one that needs to be connected between particular countries, is extremely, extremely hard. And it will necessarily lead to short-term problems. And this is enough for us to say that we shouldn't do this, because
Puoi metterlo anche nel...
sorry, can you mute yourself? Thank you. So yeah, this is one example. I'm not going to get too much into it, but I'm giving you an example of how we didn't know much about the topic, but we drew the conclusions from part of our own experience. I'm not saying learn everything about Bulgaria and you will get far in life. I'm saying you probably have other pieces of specific knowledge about your own context that might be super useful. So here is another one. This house believes that it is in the interests of Taiwan to pursue friendlier ties with China. So again, even if you don't know anything, you can ask yourself some reasonable questions. I'll let you ask the question in a bit. If they're not close with China, who are they close with right now? Well, it's probably not Russia, because that doesn't make much sense. I have heard some things that the US is involved with some other people in the region. So it's safe to assume that probably they're currently involved with the US. So there is a whole now area of arguments that I can make in this motion without knowing anything about Taiwan, but making general conclusions of why would the US or China be a better partner for an Asian country. This is anything that everything that I need to know is just about these particular things without getting in any particular knowledge. The other thing is, let's say I'm opposition and I understand, okay, I don't know much about this motion, but I know China is a much stronger state than Taiwan. What are some ways a much stronger state can exert control over you? And then I'm like, oh, I also know that China is not very democratic. Does this impact the debate? Oh, it probably does in some ways. So here's how you can, again, come up with a lot of obvious answers to obvious questions without really getting into the nitty-gritty of the motion or knowing anything about what's going on in Taiwan. I think these are a few examples I want to showcase. I don't have much time, so I'll not get more into the others. But are there any questions that you guys want to ask me before we conclude and move on with the other workshops?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Let's say in the motion there says like example political and economic. Is it necessary that we have to include those basic themes in our debate?
No. But usually it's very useful. But if you want to make this debate about something else, if you truly believe that you can do that, yeah, of course. Like these are just examples at the end of the day. You might say that, like, you might outframe all of those things. You might say, look, economically, they'll be fine with both China and the US. Politically, they'll be fine with both China and the US. Culturally, they'll be fine with both China and the US, but actually, this debate is about something else. So, yeah, you can do that, but I usually am against like walking away from the examples because they are most of the time given for a reason. And that reason is that the CA team is like, guys, this is where the debate is. Please don't miss it. But if you have a better idea, go ahead. So that's the answer.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Is there a specific like visible pattern of how I can break a topic down which I'm not well like informed about, or does it differ with every different type of motion, like every different type of topic which is raised in a motion?
So I don't have a formula for you of how to break these topics. I think a lot of the things that I said are you just have to do it for yourself, and you have to like break it into ways that make sense for you. And the way that you break it for yourself is if you want to really get super good at, let's say, these types of motions or that types of motions, the easiest way to do it is the following. Firstly, you get to sit down and watch a workshop on, let's say, economics motions, if this is the things that you want to get better at. So this is the first thing you do. The second thing you do is you sit down and you pull out 10 economic motions and you prep each of them one after another. And you write down the arguments and see the patterns that arise from, oh, most of the time economic clashes are about where do people live better or where do businesses have more money, etc., etc., etc. So you start noticing these patterns. And the third thing that you do is you go and watch a lot of recorded debates on these types of motions to also see what other people are running, so that you are also drawing from their own experience and not only yours and your understanding of these motions. And once you accumulate all of this, you will be able to have a good grasp on any motion that is connected to these types of subjects. And a lot of times you can make economic arguments on political motions or political arguments on economic motions. And this is how everything is connected. But to the question of like how to break it down, there is not one particular answer. The answer is however it makes sense for you, but there is a way to get there, which is just set the goal that you want to achieve, which is I want to get better at topics that are connected to this. Start with a workshop, see the advice that is given there, and then go on from there. Because I think that people who a lot of the time like workshops on, let's say, economics debates are most of the time given by people who have a good understanding of economics. They're either economists or they're people who have invested enough time to understand economics to a good enough level so that they can debate these motions. And they know a lot of facts. So they'll be much better equipped to walk you through some of the main areas of macroeconomics that you need to understand in order to debate these motions. And this might be entirely different for like social movement motions, for example. So don't look at it as there are these 4 questions that I need to ask myself every single time. And if I ask myself these questions, I will definitely break down the motions. Look at it as how can I make sense for myself of these types of motions, of these types of ideas that I am unfamiliar with, that confuse me a lot of the time. And if you go backwards to yourself, it will go a long way into actually understanding how to approach motions that are similar to this one every single time. Hopefully this is useful.
It is. Thank you.
Great. Okay, one more question and I'm gonna have to cut off. I think we are basically at an hour. Okay, amazing. I took almost exactly an hour.